Hello and welcome to this new episode of our EuropeChats series. Today we are going to look at the existential challenges which the European Union faces and at the response by the European Union. To this effect, I have invited Marc De Vos, who is an academic, he's a consultant, but he's also an author. He recently published a book with a rather intriguing title, Superpower Europe. I was a bit taken aback when I first looked at it, because normally you don't associate those two concepts with each other. So I wanted to find out a bit more what was behind Marc De Vos' thesis. Hello, Marc.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
My first question is really very basic. It's why did you decide to write this book at this time?
For several reasons. On a personal, deeply personal level, I just can't stand the talk of decline and defeatism and the belief that we lack agency in Europe. But the book is not about aspiration and voluntarism. The book is first and foremost a kind of affirmation of the tremendous acceleration in European integration that is ongoing, particularly since COVID. And maybe it took somebody who was far away from Europe. I lived 4 years down under, pre-COVID, during COVID, and I came back just before the invasion of the Ukraine. And the book kind of documents everything that the European Union collectively, EU member states, have done in these past couple of years. And if you sum that up and take a step back, my observation, it's not a thesis, is that Europe has become the cradle, the European Union, the cradle of superpower politics. And I see that on three axes, which is the core of the book. And therefore the undertitle of the book is a silent transformation or silent revolution, really, of the European Union, because very few people are able to take a few step back and look at the big picture. Everybody spends a lot of time on the day-to-day in the European Union, which is very messy and very confusing and very tough on a day-to-day basis. But the sum of it, I think, is quite impressive. And we need to have a sense of self-belief that this is something that we will be able to continue into the future. My thesis is that there is no turning back, that the transformation, the new direction of the EU is something that we will continue in the future.
Marc, you talk about the silent revolution. It's quite a strong expression. Can you substantiate a bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. So three axes from here. The first is, if you look back to the past, basically the high days that we kind of emotionally associate with European Union, that was community of European nations. We were spending time on how we are going to spend time with each other. We didn't have to worry about the outside world. We didn't have a sense of geographic destiny. It was a community, open. You play by the rules, you're welcome. Now, for me, it has become very much a geostrategic project. That's the first revolution, which means that our premise is, where do we need to be geographically? If you look at the list of candidate countries, you have Moldova, you have Georgia, you have Ukraine, and a few others, particularly in the Balkans. Now, those first three, they reflect the new geographic reality, because they really are a statement of intent in the relationship between the European part and the Russian part of the Eurasian continent. And whether we will be able to pull it off, that statement of intent, in terms of having those type of countries into the fold of the European Union, one way or the other, that's another matter. But this has become the leitmotif. So that's a first, for me, revolution. Geostrategic, also reflected in the fact that we've done this huge migration deal, where for the very first time we have common outside borders, external borders, which means a common security policy for these borders and a common international relations policy for these borders. That's geostrategic. That's revolution. We used to be a get rid of the borders club. Now we make the borders and we enforce them.
But can I just interject that is true? But at the same time, we seem to be reintroducing the borders within the EU and to call into question Schengen. What do you say to that?
Yes, and I think that's more of the same. And that is because we haven't reached the full mature stage of guaranteeing security in one border. So for me, that's a transitional issue. So geostrategic is one revolution for me. The second revolution is the switch from soft power to hard power, from free trade and human rights to geopolitics and security. And this is happening on a daily basis. Can anybody ignore that the focus of attention and energy today in Europe and in the past couple of years has been about securing our borders, securing our economy, securing our supply of energy, kind of pooling resources and strategic thinking around defense? Can anybody ignore that we have weaponized free trade for geopolitical purposes? That the European Union, that was the seat of trade liberalization, is now the seat of deglobalization for Europe. And that we have unleashed sanctions regimes, that we have created instruments to secure the market in Europe against foreign interference, dumping, security, that we now go to the next stage, well, strategic autonomy, and getting a sense of made in Europe, and getting industrial policy back, which was dead and buried for many decades. And all that passes through the European Union, one way or the other. So that is a fundamental paradigm shift for me. Yeah?
But can I ask you a question? Isn't it a bit the case that all of this seems to be happening without many Europeans even being aware of it? Because after all, isn't it the case that Europe was basically out of history and out of geopolitics after the Second World War, because everything was being decided in Washington, basically, and that now we are sort of, it's not as though the Europeans have, come together and said, we will now become geopolitic. It's more, they have the back against the wall and they have to react. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I call it silent revolution. It's not open. It's not recognized. It's not by our various leaders, particularly the domestic leaders. It's not something that is openly advocated, except perhaps because we have to be aware we have both from Western Europe. I think realities in Central and Eastern Europe, where the front line is much closer, is quite different. And there, the kind of public recognition that we're in a new phase, I think is much more realized. But for certain, the average citizen, I would even say the person who is interested, even professionally, even implicated into the machinery of the EU, is not always kind of cognizant of the fact that if you look at the cumulative effect of all the ad hoc day-to-day compromises that are being decided, where we're heading in Europe, and the consequence of all these. And that's for me the third transformation, and that goes back to your question, is that the role of the EU as an institution has become kind of like a superpower state, because it passes through the EU, but the EU obviously hasn't been set up as a super state. Yeah? So that goes back to the real kind of issue we will somehow have to evolve in one way or the other, is that this needs to be democratically embedded somehow.
That's an interesting point, and it brings me to a question which I'm struggling with, to be very honest with you, because as you rightly explain in your book, I think what is going on in the world, which is a much tougher world, it's a multipolar world with various strong players. What goes on there in a way forces us to become tougher, to go more into hard power. And the big question will be, but will we simply become like the others? Start behaving like the United States, or let alone China? I don't think so. So can we actually square our basic DNA, which is the basis of our European integration, with becoming a superpower? Isn't that a huge challenge?
There are always going to be compromises. Yeah? And we know from the history of the Cold War that doing realpolitik is sometimes dirty compromises. We know that. But I see a lot of space to marry hard power with values, personally. So I do believe that if we get our act together and we become more of an autonomous player in security and defense, particularly in our part of the world, so that we become the architect of our security architecture, this will be a force for the good and not for the bad. And that many countries look at the European political community that was invented after the invasion of Ukraine. That covers the entire European part of Eurasia and a number of periphery countries, even countries like Azerbaijan, Turkey, the UK. That shows you that these countries believe in the idea that security as a collective European enterprise would be beneficial for a lot of countries. So I do believe that we can stick to some of our core beliefs, but if you want to have soft power in the world today, which is our core beliefs, our values, you need to have hard power as well.
Yes. If you only talk about values and you don't defend your interests, you're going to lose your interests and your values.
That's right. And we've always counted on the Americans to stand up for the values. And we can't continue to rely on the Americans, regardless of somebody like Trump, who obviously behaves in ways that we don't want to behave. America has its own set of geopolitical struggles vis-a-vis China, in its own hemisphere, in the Middle East. And the shift from America to Asia was already underway under Obama. So we have to acknowledge that if we want security on our terms, the terms that align with our values, then we have to take ownership.
What struck me in your book, and I found this very interesting, I knew, of course, about this, but you summed it up very nicely. It's that, for instance, in the trade area, we adopted a whole string of measures, autonomous measures, which allow ourselves to defend. If you can say a word about that, because I thought that was a very rapid movement over the last few years, wasn't it?
Yes. I think we have never seen an acceleration in European integration since the dawn of the initiative right after the Second World War, in the midst of the Cold War. And actually, I think to some extent we are trying to redo what was attempted and failed in the early 50s in terms of defense, security, and political unification. But it is under a lot of external pressure that we act, and that has always been the case. But the fait accompli of the things that we've done. So creating an internal market that is shielded from, let's say, the type of interference and economic connections that we find geopolitically undesirable in the New World. That has been the core mission of the European Commission in the first von der Leyen mandate. Yeah? It called itself a geopolitical commission for that reason. We have succeeded in, not entirely, but to a large extent, and it will continue, to detach ourselves from Russia in the energy sphere. That was not easy to do. Yeah? And it happened. We have set up the machinery to kind of counterbalance the influence of China. If we want to, you have to implement it. You have to make it live. This is quite substantial, and we've now complemented it with identifying the areas where we want a strategic autonomy, where we want resilience of the economy if things like a pandemic happen again, which means that you're creating a much more self-reliant economy. If you add to that the agendas that have now been prepared, the Draghi report, the Letta report. So you push your market integration, you create even more scale, you do strategic investments in certain areas, so you become a global player in these areas. I think we're on the right track.
We have a lot of diversity. You talk about the single market. I'm struck by the fact that there are important parts of the single market we simply haven't delivered, have we? For instance, services. And we're talking about capital markets union. But we still haven't done it. So there are strong resistances to what you're explaining.
Yes, and so it's not a given that we will eventually succeed. In the observation of the book is, by the force of external events, with our backs against the wall, we, the 27 member states, collectively, compromise by compromise, have decided that in the areas of geopolitics and hard power, we're going to try it in a combined way in tandem with the EU. Therefore, the EU is the cradle of superpower politics. But if we want to make the EU a true superpower in its own right, that can stand its ground globally, obviously we need to push it forward. And I think the groundwork for that has been done. And the new von der Leyen Commission, with a lot of external pressure again, I think will take significant steps forward. Will it be perfect? No. Is it going to be as quick, as deep, as scaled as something like the US could do or China could do? No, because we are not, Brussels is not Beijing or Washington, D.C. You don't have the concentration of political power, you don't have a unified national country, and you don't have the money.
But Max, there are two big issues which I think we have to address. The first one is, can you be a superpower if you don't have a defense system and an army and a government? And the second question is, particularly in the quarters here in Brussels, is always the elephant in the room, in my view, has been for 20 years or more. It's our relationship with the United States. Because it seems to me that we talk strategic autonomy vis-à-vis China, fine, vis-à-vis Russia, and when it's the United States, it's the transatlantic relationship, and many people still seem to believe that we can go back to the future. What do you think about that, those two issues?
Let me put it this way. Obviously, we are in, let's say, the foothills of the climb towards a pan-European defense reality, under the pressure of Putin and Trump, which I think we should welcome as a pressure, because it's in the long term going to be beneficial, provided the conflict in Ukraine ends in a proper way. That's another debate. But I think to get to defense, I would take even one step back and say, what is it that you need first and foremost is a bandwidth of common strategic international kind of agenda, which includes your second question. How do you want to position ourselves as a bloc vis-à-vis the US, vis-à-vis China? That's the first question. Before you can talk security and defense, you need to have a common international strategy to a sufficient degree. And that's where we're lacking, obviously. We're always in the reactive mode, in the crisis management mode, and we don't do long-term strategic enough. So what is needed for that? I think you need a few engines among some of the big member states. My ideal, it's a hope, it's not a prediction, it's a hope, is that you could say if the German elections turn out in a way that the polls are currently predicting, so Mr. Merz becomes the new chancellor and is much more bullish, then perhaps you could see an axis, Italy, Germany and France under Macron, who will want a legacy, and Poland. And you could say on that axis, we could do things. And doing things in areas like defense, for me, and that is, I think, the key art that we have to develop in Europe in the next couple of years, means that we both coordinate and plan and steer from the EU level, but you allow individual member states and groups of member states in that direction to move faster and deeper.
Which is something we've always done.
Look
at Schengen, for instance.
We've always done it.
And which, in a way, is easier in an area which is not integrated, like defense. You're basically free to do what you can. So, and this brings me to another question. It's the question of governance in the EU. If I understand you correctly, you are not in favor of federal institutionalization. I mean, institutions being federalized. If I understand you correctly, you're in favor of federalizing policies as necessary. Is that a correct reading of your book?
I think it is. And this is more the pragmatist in me that is speaking. I don't believe in the viability of a constitutional exercise and saying we have our Hamiltonian moment in Europe. We need to write a new treaty. I think that's going to waste a lot of very valuable political energy, which we cannot afford to waste. We need to focus. And I think the institutions and the structures and the processes will eventually catch up with reality. That's how I think it will evolve. And the first and foremost priority is what I said, this synchronization between EU and domestic. I think that is the key because, and that's my third transformation. Because of these previous two, the geostrategic part, the geopolitical part, the hard power part, you actually now look at the EU almost like a state actor. Because that is no longer market forces. The EU used to be free trade and internal market, very technocratic, not political, a little bit political, but not really, and certainly not geopolitical. So now that that is at EU level, we are basically saying we are looking at the EU as if it were a super state, but it isn't. Yeah. So how to make that work? Because if you say the state in Europe, and you can't go through the EU, you say it's the panoply of 27 countries. How to make that work in a collective way, in an integrated way, that we scale and pool, that we don't do arms races of national subsidies against each other, that we actually think alike in our positioning vis-a-vis China and the US, that we don't get divided by these external forces. Those are the tricky things to do, particularly now that the geopolitical part of obviously is much more closer to national political priorities and sensitivities. It also has, just think of Russia. The conflict in Ukraine has brought history back in Europe. The relationship with Russia for certain countries that we know, think of Hungary or Slovakia, or you can say Austria or Germany, is different historically. It's deeply rooted in identity. So that is now back on the table in Europe. And we thought that history was over.
I completely agree with that analysis. I mean, we've been flung back into history. But you mentioned Hungary and countries like that. I mean, at the same time, we're now in a situation where we have a rise of the Eurosceptic movements, extreme right mostly, across Europe. How do you see that? Will that impede this move towards becoming a true power? I mean, if you look at those forces, they're basically nationalist forces. They should actually be in favor of autonomy for Europe. But do they see it as an autonomy for Europe or for their individual countries? And how is this going to pan out?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a liability, for sure. And that political diversity that we have within Europe has become all the more potent because of the type of issues that Europe now has to address collectively. And I don't think there is a quick fix for it. I also think that you have to respect the flow of history a bit. You have to respect that certain countries are in a certain moment of their national history where other countries in Europe are perhaps a little bit further down the line, and that you have to embrace that actually and respect it and say, how is it that we can find some kind of balance and allow certain countries to do things that other countries are not going to do without that jeopardizing the mission? And so I do think there is a limit to doing everything by 27 and then ganging up on the few dissenters. I think there's a limit to that. And I think we have to become a bit more flexible and a bit more creative still. And I see that emerging. I mean, we had around defense is already one example where you see individual countries, you see groupings of countries. We are recording this while yesterday there was an informal summit where the UK was back. So security and defense as a mission of the new EU means that to that extent, Brexit is actually over. Yeah. So that is tremendous. So embrace that. And the UK is not going to be a full actor. So you have to be a little bit bespoke and see what is it that we have common ground. So that is, I think, the art for Europe's mission to actually make a dent in what it needs to do in the short term.
Should we not also become a bit more pragmatic vis-a-vis the outside world? We talked a bit about the United States, and I think we agreed that we need more autonomy there too, quite clearly, because it determines all our policies. China. What is your take on China? I mean, a few years ago, we developed what I thought was quite a coherent strategy. partner in some areas, competitor in others, and ideological rival. Now, under the pressure of the United States, we seem to have moved to only talking about the third aspect. What is your take? What should we do vis-à-vis China?
Look, this is my personal opinion. So I think we are in a world where we have, to varying degrees, three strategic adversaries at the same time in Europe. Russia, which is probably a full-scale adversary. China, which is a partial adversary. And the US, which is also a partial adversary. So how can we manage that well for the long-term stability, security, prosperity? That's the question. Well, look, I'm a believer that with all the fluxes of politics and history, the ties between the US and Europe go much deeper than the ties that we could cultivate between Europe and China. I also know one thing that I would not want to do at all, that is shift a dependency that we had from Russia on energy to a dependency from China on post-fossil technology.
Right.
I don't want that as a matter of principle, to avoid risks. I'd rather have dependencies with the US if we can't avoid them, like we have them on defense at the moment. It's not easy to get the US to keep on paying, but so far they have. And I do think there is room to make a deal with the Trump administration that they will continue to support in an interim, provided there is another phase where Europe really steps up. So I personally believe there is more room if you look at the global picture, because there's also the global south with emerging powers, countries like India and so on. There's the Middle East. I do think there's much more sense in seeking strategic alignment that is an and proposition. So not just about burden sharing with the US, but burden shifting. So that we create mutually a value proposition for each other. I see much more space for that between EU and the US than I see it between EU and China.
I take this point, but isn't there a problem to some extent with this? Isn't that sort of pleading for a continuation of the alliance of democracies against the rest, the West against the rest? I'm a bit more skeptical about that, because you talk about the global south. I mean, the global south is not global at all, except on one thing. They are all fed up with Americans and Europeans preaching to them and being often extremely hypocritical. If you look at our reactions to Gaza compared to Ukraine and all of that. So isn't that a bit of a problem that I do agree with you, we will be closer to the United States, but I am a bit more guarded, I think, in terms of being necessarily with the United States to deal with India and all of those countries. I think we should be much more autonomous there.
Can't speak about individual cases, but as a matter of kind of the general picture, I would say by definition into the future, the relationship is going to be more of a duo of equals, of almost equals, provided we do a few things that we've intended to do, which is first and foremost our defense and security. So NATO becomes basically a two-pillar organization, which gives you kind of the room to operate, which is also a shift because let's be honest, the US wants us to pay up in NATO, but for a very long time, the US has not wanted the EU to develop autonomic defense capabilities.
Each time we did it, they sabotaged it with the Brits at the time. So that would be a nice deal to say to Trump, we are going to invest much more, but it cannot just be for the American industry.
Absolutely. So that if you succeed in that, by definition, you gain more room for maneuvering because soft power and hard power go together. So your relationship with these type of countries is much more like a complete kind of palette where you say, yes, we are values driven. So therefore, you'll be happy actually to deal with us, provided we don't preach too much to you. Yeah. And we can also actually do some security stuff, and then the same goes for our strategic autonomy and our internal market. If we do that right, in certain sectors, we will be less dependent on the strength of the US economy and big US multinationals. So by definition, I think the relationship will then become a different type of relationship, a kind of relationship fit for the 21st century rather for the 20th century. And if we do that, then I think, well, we will see how China evolves. Let's not forget, these are all moving targets. So I personally, I don't have a crystal ball, but I have more confidence in the future trajectory of the US because of the deep connections and history than in the future trajectory of China, which has been going towards authoritarianism, Leninism inside the country, kind of aggressive posturing, nationalism outside, and the issue of Taiwan, one way or the other, in the near future, will become a live issue. So I think we have to be very careful there and see actually what is China going to become in the 21st century, because it's still very much in transition.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Marc. I have one last question, a very short one, and then I think we unfortunately have to conclude. I would have loved to go on for another hour. The question is, what kind of reactions did you get to your book? Have you received a lot of reactions, criticism? Were people saying you're completely out of the world with your thesis? I mean, what kind of reactions have you received so far?
Well, first of all, it was very hard to find a publisher because the publisher told me nobody's interested in Europe. Nobody's going to buy it. No. So that turned out to be different. It's available in 3 languages, selling well. So I think a lot of people, and if you look at the opinion polls, a lot of people in Europe actually realize that we all need a strong European Union, in this world that we're in. Secondly, so obviously, if you talk about these topics with people who are not in the day-to-day involved in European affairs, there's a lot of surprise, actually. A lot of surprise about all the things that have been done now to make these things visible, to see them successfully implemented on a daily basis. That is still a step into the future. We will see. Just think about issues like migration, think about defense, etc. People will have to see it and then believe it. If you talk about people who are more closely to European affairs, there's also surprise. There's a degree of kind of realization that, yes, we can actually have some self-belief, even though it's very complicated and slower compared to integrated countries like the US and so on. We actually potentially are going through the most rapid phase of European unification since World War II. Actually, we're there. We're doing this on a daily basis, and it's not over. If you look at the plans that we've made for the next couple of years, if we only succeed in getting half of it done, it's already going to be another very significant phase. But the key thing, I think, and that is something that I feel many people relate to when you talk about it, we have to find again our agency and the fact that we become master of our own destiny in this world. And that many people acknowledge. So I hope that through the book I can contribute to this kind of purpose, a common purpose.
Thank you very much, Marc. I think that was fascinating, and I think you came up with a very nice conclusion. We have to take our destiny into our own hands. This concludes today's Europe Chat. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to react, because I think Marc made a lot of points which one can debate, one can discuss. I think we need this kind of discussion in Europe today, because we are living momentous times, and I think contributions of this type, which are a bit more positive, less doom and gloom, that Europe is lost, I think are a useful contribution. Of course, we also need to hear people who are more critical. So stay tuned in, and we will continue with our Europe Chats in the future. Thank you very much.